Hello, welcome to the 10th episode of Global Pause Rethink the Future, a podcast dealing with the cultural impasse of consumerism and broader still our market-orientated way of life. So in this episode we're going to be looking at our values and essentially how we can, through the exception, start to bring into play what we otherwise would consider to be of secondary importance. So we have touched upon in a few episodes prior the nature of interpersonal exchanges being intrapersonal exchanges, whereby the preeminent good of our time predominates. And so essentially when we're looking at the way how values or what we value or what is secondary will come to the fore is by looking at the way how we will essentially potentialise our time in order for us to recognise that. So that's essentially what we're going to be covering off in today's episode. And so it's obviously all this is orientated towards a different way of giving and receiving. So it's very much focused on the praxis that we can put that praxis that we can do in order to bring about some kind of substantive change within the world to orientate ourselves beyond the holding pattern that we accept for ourselves. So I'll frame it again. So the nature of exchanges are intrapersonal rather than interpersonal, because every exchange that we enter into that would be considered to be interpersonal is underwritten by the preeminent good of our time. And as a result of that, those exchanges are secondary or subordinate to that preeminent good. And so as a result of that, they are of secondary value. We touched upon this in the last episode that a market-orientated way of life, when you are orientated towards your time, there is essentially no market for that outside the orientation you have to secure your time as a supplement. So because there is no place for that market, and it's inherently utopian, there is no place for the market is very much an intrapersonal, so an exchange that you have with yourself. You secure your temporality or your time as an economic good by understanding that you have to obviously labour in order to secure that supplement of time. And as a result of that preeminent good that you're always focused on, it means to say that any exchange that you engage into or enter into are always secondary to that overarching consideration. And so as a result of that, your want, so it doesn't matter what you engage in as far as the exchange goes, it can be anything, is always subordinate to your time, because you're orientated towards securing it. So when we're looking at the exceptions that you can make in order to potentialise your time, which we're talking about is a preeminent good, then the way what we're going to be looking at is a way how, by potentialising your time, one of the things that it does when you are potentialising a person's time or your time is for you to actually start to value what you otherwise would consider to be secondary. All right, because like we said, the preeminent good of your time is the one thing that you are primarily focused on, and it's a given. So you don't have an intentionality in the sense that every time that you enter into an interpersonal exchange, or what would consider to be an interpersonal exchange, because it's accepted as a given, it's just unthought, and you just pass over it without question. So ultimately, my podcast is all about unearthing what is just basically, concealed right in front of our face. And the reason why we're focusing on it is because when lifestyle is touted as the end in itself, and that by default substantiates securing your temporality in order to furnish the vision you have for yourself, in order for you to emulate the lifestyle that you're orientated towards, well, ultimately you're looking at time is the denominator here, but it's very much that obscures or conceals essentially a different praxis or a different way of life that could engender a world beyond that reduction or that given. So When you're potentialising your time, because we talked about, and there's a few episodes before, the nature of our way of life being market-orientated beings and always being set upon in order to our existence is dismonetized. We are commodities, or we are a product, and so therefore the orientation towards a market-orientated way of life by default of that orientation means to say that our consciousness is always set upon. So in the scenario of our way of life, in order for you to potentially see value that is otherwise concealed or obscured for the want of your time that predominates, ultimately exceptions have to come from business, because they're the ones that are trying to orientate you towards monetization, as it were. So... And we talked about the nature of cynicism that is engendered when acts that work contra to the given, like a commercial orientated way, you would consider them to be just another tactic in order to engage you, to engender the loyalty or the goodwill for that specific business. But what we're detailing out in these podcasts is essentially a practice that both you as a person and businesses, which essentially are people, or they're all people working towards a commercial end. But ultimately, if you're looking what underwrites the enterprise, so whether or not business consider it solely to be a commercial activity, or whether or not they consider their business to be an enterprise, which is really beyond a commercial orientation. So if a business is engaging you as a person by, touting values or ideals or anything else like that, they're really positioning their business, not strictly speaking, as a commercial enterprise, unless they're doing that to position themselves in the market. And as a result of that whole focus, that they engender cynicism. So when we're looking at the praxis that we're setting out for ourselves, ultimately it's looking at the way how the deferment to enterprise good as a custodian for the idea breaks the cynicism that otherwise would be engendered if business starts to engage you as a person. So therefore, rather than consider you as a commodity or as a product or as a consumer, and so orientate you towards an exchange, their orientation is beyond the exchange to essentially what is outside the market. And this relates to the culture that would be engendered beyond the exchange, that would over time furnish a different way of life, a different way of giving and receiving. So in order to do that, it has to make exceptions, obviously, of your commerce. So we're looking at the nexus of time equals money. So in order to do that, your time persists. Okay, so it removes the nexus or the leverage of money in order to potentialise your time. So to do so here is, in this regard, is to... We talked about this in a few episodes prior about the way how it potentialises you as a person in order to engender, I suppose, the dissemination of the idea with other people, but also what it primarily focuses on is really looking at the value that is otherwise concealed for the want of using money, or when we should say, because it's not just money. Money is only as a sign. We're looking at the way how your time predominates as a good. And so obviously money, when you equate your time equals money, that's essentially why it's not money in and of itself, is because we count our temporality, I suppose, through time, and then we style that by the visions that we emulate, that substantiates lifestyle obsession, which I just alluded to prior. So in order for you to potentialise your time, in order for you to see the value that you otherwise don't see, because and mind you, because we talked about the nature of, say for instance, I go down the street and I buy all right, let's say I go down the street and I'm going to buy an ice cream, okay? All right, so I'm going to buy an ice cream. But in the scenario that we're talking about here, where the business owner is part of the enterprise good as an ecosystem, as it were, they make an exception of my exchange, okay? So in the scenario here is that because I go down the street and I don't give due consideration to that every single interpersonal exchange that I enter into, I don't really give consideration to my time as the underwriter of that exchange. All right, so therefore it's not thought. When the exception is made to my commerce, now what what occurs here? Now, once again, it's kind of nebulous in the sense that it's very much beholden to the specific person. So does it mean to say that they have to have a certain element of knowledge, or does the omission is enough for them to reflect upon that omission and maybe see what they otherwise don't have the ability to see, or then sets them upon their way towards that? And I suppose it's the orientation that we have to give due consideration to, and not necessarily the goal to a realisation. Because if it's just accepted as a given that you go down, you buy an ice cream and I buy it, well, then nothing ever is put into play, is it not? But when looking at the way how things can be orientated beyond the given, so we have to bear that in mind, that the process and the way how this thing will unfold, it's not that you're going to have some epiphany from the first time a business makes an exception of your commerce. But if that's done in a way, in different turns within the market, then what you're getting is you're getting these little turns that add up to something that's greater than the sum of its parts, obviously, and by default of the iteration of the same, the reoccurrence of the same, as it were, it has the ability for the fragments of these little micro events to add up, to be connected through other people and for it to disseminate. But let's take it. What happens here is, we talked about the nature of gratitude, I suppose, is what are the things that what's the initial response, I suppose, is what we need to look at. What is the first thing that a person would take away? All right, so they receive what is now a boon, as it were. It's just been given. All right, and I talked about the nature of that. Can you be truly grateful when you've paid for something because you've paid for it, and so you cancel out the debt, as it were? Now, not to say that there's any kind of debt that I would owe in the scenario, but what it is that it makes a claim, I suppose, on me, and the initial response is to have a sense of gratitude. It's one of these things that you are thankful for. We thank without thinking, I suppose. We don't think of when we give thanks to somebody, especially if it's just a mere courtesy. But in the scenario where the exception has been made and so the commerce has been removed, and then so you receive this as essentially as a gift, and it's a gift in the sense that there's not any return that would cancel that out. What it does, it puts into play maybe the effects, that could reverberate beyond that, but it doesn't necessarily cancel itself out. In that scenario, you cannot help but be grateful. So maybe that's the first response but what are you grateful for is what we have to understand. So, am I grateful for that I just received something for free? Is the way how it lands, is that enough to evoke the kind of response from me to be thankful? Why do we give thanks? Why is it? And maybe this is the thing. Maybe we don't give enough thanks to. So we think about what we give thanks for. Like, where are we? I suppose is one of the things that you need to look at in the scenario of when you are giving thanks. Now we have all these, I suppose, hollowed out, empty kind of rituals where people do give thanks, or what they are is that they're very much circumscribed to specific rituals in certain times of the year. But the whole nature of what we're putting into play when you are looking at making exceptions and then potentialising a person's time to see value beyond their own time is to truly give thanks. And if these events are such that through their iteration, people are going to reflect and start to give thanks and to be present when they do so, then that is maybe the initial step in order for a person to reflect upon where they are and what they actually value. All right, so we would have to say in this context that giving thanks is the initiatory kind of step, is the initiation that needs to occur in order for people to really start to reflect upon where they are. Because say, for instance, in a scenario that I go down the street and I've just received this thing and I give thanks for it, all right, and so therefore I've taken away, like I said, that the nature of the way how this will occur is that it potentializes the exception the more that this goes down. So you don't necessarily know that it's going to occur, but you can frame the expectation that it has, but you never know when it will occur. All right, so it always comes out of the blue as much as that you might expect it. But in the scenario here, so if we're talking about the first initiating event where I give thanks to the person for receiving this thing, and they give it without any kind of supplementary discourse that would then substantiate it and then ground it, which is probably the best way how this thing has to occur. Like I said, this is all very nebulous, and nothing is defined as such, and maybe it's very much on the circumstance. If I engaged with the owner there and say, why did you do that? Now they could answer the way they see fit. It's not beholden to what I say, but let's say in the scenario that I don't, that I accept it, I'm thankful, and I go on my way. So like we said, so I can give thanks, and then obviously, we talked about the nature of cynicism, that I could just, think, well, that's just, why is it, why? It's like, why? Thank you, but then it's like, why? What is it? And so it's the why that kind of haunts the thankfulness that you have. But that why is that is a precursor, I suppose, to in order to ground ourselves as to where we are, I suppose is what I'm kind of getting at. Because, the nature of the way how this thing emerges, I mean, it's the emergence is not through the one act. It's obviously the multiplicity of acts and the way how this thing starts to turn us around in the same spot, mind you. It turns us to orientate ourselves beyond the orientation towards the exchange to that utopian, we're beholden to the utopia, as it were. This is the nature of the way how this thing works. It literally is just orientating you to look somewhere that you never bloody looked before, that we've never looked before at all of us, because we accept it as a given. We accept it without thought. So that precursor of giving thanks is, or the thanks is the precursor towards the orientation away from the exchange. So not the exchange that of me buying an ice cream, but the intrapersonal exchanges of our time being the predominant good, the preeminent good that we're focused on, that we don't consider, or we don't give due consideration, so we pass over it without thinking about what is the opportunity cost, I suppose, for us to be beholden to that. What are we concealing from ourselves when we accept that as a given? So to give thanks for the ability for that question to arise is important in the whole overture of the way how this thing will disseminate. And I suppose I'm not really addressing, I'm addressing the initial potentialization beyond actually then crystallizing how through the iteration that the actual thing or the person or the world of provisioning and the earth thrusts upon us in a way that otherwise would be concealed if we accept our time as a given. And I touched upon this on the last episode about the nature of that utopian kind of, because we are, we're spellbound by this utopia where the externalities, they're just so impossible to actually deal with because we live in this idealised world. We don't even realise that we externalise human relations for the preeminent good of our time because it's all convenience. It's all about the more that we account for our time, the less that we have of it. And we do that very much through the medium of money. So when money is removed, it potentialises us to reflect in a way where what is it? These externalities that we can't even see. And so pollution is very easy for us to see, but the externality of human relation and then what happens as a result of externalising human relations for the sake of our want satisfaction is the absolute spiritual issue of our age, that because we take our time as a given and we don't give it due consideration, we don't understand the ramifications or the significance of that when we accept our time as a given. And that you just go down the street, everybody is like focused on going about their business, but going about your business is nothing else other than that intra-personal exchange, that thing that you are beholden to, that you never actually question. And so in order for the nexus of time equals money, in order to remove money, it's very much pressing upon the values here. It's potentializing the realization for you to really, what is it that you value most? Now, if you say your own time, then you're beholden to a way of life that doesn't put anything into play than what is not already given. This is the thing, and this is why the exception, through the exceptions that are made, detours or cuts or defers that, where it opens out another vista that we just don't even realise is there. So I'm just going to leave it at that, because I feel that gives you a little bit more ground as to the way how, the exception potentializes our time, that we give thanks, that we have, that maybe giving thanks gives us room to reflect upon where we are, where we really start to reflect, start to ground what we value, and realise that the idealism that we are very much beholden to, and that our utopian way of life, is ultimately disincarnating. And in order to see through that, the exception has to be made in order to potentialise you, to actually ground you to where you are. We are on the earth, all right? We are of the earth, and this is the one thing that is absolutely critical. You don't need to orientate ourselves towards these transcendences or anything, these vertical transcendence, or emulating a sovereignty that is removed from the world, or that approximates it, or approximates divinity, or whatever the case may be. Now, I know that I'm saying that if you're looking at the way how wealth is, or what, the transcendence that you're focused on, I always come back to it. It's an intra-mundane transcendence, but it's a transcendence nonetheless. So it's just removing yourself from the drudgery of making a living. And so the whole nature of it might not necessarily, it's spiritual in aspiration. There's no doubt about it. It's a spiritual aspiration. There's no difference between that aspiration and a person feeling that they need to save their soul, as it were. And so until next time, take care.